So today we're going to speak about a certain concept that I have. I'm going to decided to speak about a certain concept that I possess today about Klal Yisrael and also Olam Haba and certain things and so on. The essence of Klal Yisrael, its formation of the Jewish people of Klal Yisrael, is a very strange concept in the sense that it really refers to a certain principle that the Rebbe wanted to establish in this world, in human history in this world. The concept was that when Rebbe created the concept of Klal Yisrael, it referred to the concept of what mankind was. Mankind originally was in a homogeneous state where all men were basically equal in their fundamental destiny. That means that the fundamental concept of what a Jew is, what the concept of a Jew is, really the definition of a Jew is not simply a person who does the mitzvahs, the Taryag mitzvahs of the Torah. That's not the real concept of what a Jew is. The real concept of a Jew is someone who does certain mitzvahs by the act of free will. Doing mitzvahs by the act of free will, he converts Olam Hazeh, which is the physical universe, this universe where we live, and he transforms it into an eternal world called Olam Haba, which has no end in time, is not even encompassed in the concept of time. It's fundamentally his ability to transform a world which relates to the idea of becoming as opposed to the idea of being. In Olam Haba, we are in a state of being, and that's fundamentally the force which governs us. We exist in Olam Haba in a state of being and so on. But what has been established is that in Olam Hazeh, which is this world, this physical universe, it is not so much a state of being. It is actually a state of becoming, because the fundamental principle, the tikkun of Nam Mitzvah, is that one has to earn or one has to achieve his destiny in Olam Haba before he gets to Olam Haba. That's the problem of Nam Mitzvah, and I'm not going to go into that at this point. By being masak in the concept of Olam Haba, of Olam Hazeh, with his Nam Mitzvah, by performing the mitzvahs and by doing the what God asks, it actually results. It's not simply that he gets a reward in Olam Haba, but he is responsible for the process of forming Olam Haba, which is changing the world itself as it exists from two states, from one state to another. The primary state, what it's in Olam Hazeh is in a state, is a physicality of multiplicity. And it's the job of the Jew to be able to change that state from one of becoming, arriving at a certain destiny or achieving a certain amount of existence, to a state of being where he exists in that state forever. This is the essence of a Jew, and is really the definition of a Jew. The amount of mitzvahs that he does to achieve this objective, of course, is variable. It starts with Adam Rishon with one mitzvah, and then it goes to the Bnei Noach, mankind itself, which is 7 mitzvahs, the 7 mitzvahs Bnei Noach, and finally results in the final stature of 630 mitzvahs. The purpose of the 630 mitzvahs, as opposed to 7 mitzvahs or 1 mitzvah, is to establish the concept of guarantee. With the mitzvah, with 1 mitzvah in his source, with the 7 mitzvahs in his source, he cannot guarantee his position as the one who would create the possibility of Olam Haba. There is no guarantee. If he does the mitzvahs adequately, then he fundamentally guarantees that the physical universe will transform into a spirit universe which will be eternal. If he does not do the mitzvahs, either one mitzvah of Adam Rishon or 7 mitzvahs of Bnei Noach, it will not happen. And he possibly submits himself to the possibility of annihilation. In other words, there's no guarantee that the person can actually arrive at Olam Haba. But once God gave 630 mitzvahs, once the Torah now is given in the form of not 1 mitzvah, not 7 mitzvahs, but the Torah is in the form of 630 mitzvahs, it suddenly creates the possibility of a guarantee. Because that Torah of 630 mitzvahs suddenly contains performance mitzvahs, things you have to do, like thou shalt not steal, or you have to keep Shabbos and so on, to rehabilitation mitzvahs, where at least a great deal of the Torah is concerned with doing certain things that if you should sin, if you perform certain sins, you can undo the damage that was done by the sins, according to mechanisms that are actually prescribed in the Torah itself. And therefore, this submits a guarantee. The guarantee is called, from the Gemara, Yisrael, a Jew, Yisrael, Afa Pisha Chota, even though he sins, Yisrael, he's still considered a Jew. In other words, he cannot lose the title of the Jew, which means a Ben Olam Haba. The term Yisrael literally refers to, it's composed of the terms, Yisrael is composed of the terms Sar Kael, the Prince of God. So it really refers to a person who's a Ben Olam Haba, and he only exists in Olam Hazeh as a stage of becoming to get to Olam Haba. But as someone who has the identity of Yisrael, he's a Ben Olam Haba. So therefore, the Jew is the most powerful one in a state of 630 mitzvahs. But once he achieves that state, even though he achieves the state of guarantee, the actual structure of mankind changes. Originally, mankind was homogeneous, where everyone in the world at that time, whether it's Adam Rishon or whether it's mankind to the Bnei Noach, all had that power to create Olam Haba. But now the power is exclusively given to the Jews. The definition of a Jew changed. The number of people who are considered Jewish changed. And a Jew is fundamentally a person who is a Ben Olam Haba, who is destined to be in the future world, which is eternal. And this definition changed so that mankind now becomes heterogeneous. It becomes different destinies for different people. The actual gatekeeper, what God did was he created 2 different species of mankind, whereas before mankind was one species, a Ben Olam Haba of 7 mitzvahs, or 1 mitzvah. But now mankind is no longer destined to be a Ben Olam Haba with an absolute guarantee. Mankind is divided between what's called the gatekeepers, those people who actually create Olam Haba, and the recipients of Olam Haba, those people who reside or inhabit Olam Haba, but cannot create Olam Haba. And this is really the distinction between a Jew and a Gentile, a Jew and a Goy. God retained the concept of a Jew about a person who can actually create eternity from the physical universe. To be excluded only to the children of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, Abraham, Isaac and Yaakov, and anyone else who joins the tribe of Israel. All those people are considered gatekeepers because they can actually create the construction of Olam Haba, or eternity. Everyone else who is not a Jew by definition, therefore has the term a Goy, or from the nations of the world. And Goyim also have the ability to reside, to exist in Olam Haba, but they do not have the ability to create it. They cannot go from a world of becoming to a world of being. They cannot. But once the world transforms to a state of being, to Olam Haba, then they can have the opportunity to reside there on a much lower level, but they cannot cause this world to come into being. So the concept of Yisrael is this concept that he is someone who's guaranteed the possibility of getting Olam Haba, and he can actually create Olam Haba itself. Everyone else cannot do that. Now, the Jew fundamentally is defined in two ways that describe their distinction, and this is what the Torah says. All those people who have now the power to create Olam Haba, the concept of a gate, now have a certain relationship with the rest of mankind who cannot create it, because they simply do not become two different species entirely. They are all actually B'nai Olam Haba. Even a goy is a Ben Olam Haba, should he be worthy of it in some way. In other words, if a goy keeps the original 7 mitzvahs which were given to Noah for man, to Noah and Adam for mankind, then he can reside in Olam Haba. But the ability to create Olam Haba is only given to the Jew. But his definition is really in two parts. His definition that he's a goy kadosh and mamlachos kahanim. And this is what the Torah says, that the Jew who can create Olam Haba, it actually has two titles. He has a title of a goy kadosh, and the title that's a holy nation, and the title of a mamlechus kahanim, a kingdom of priests. And what is the difference between these two definitions? A goy kodesh fundamentally is what? Is a holy people, a people who converts physicality in a physical universe to spirituality in a spiritual universe that is eternal. That's the concept of a goy kodesh, and that, of course, is the original function of what the Jews were, of what mankind was, what the Jews were. However, there's a new term that's also added to the Jew that didn't exist before, and that's the concept of a mamlechus kohanim, a kingdom of priests. In other words, he has a relationship, the Jew, the Yisrael, has a certain relationship with those people who cannot create Olam Haba on their own, the Goyim. But he still has a relationship, he still has certain obligations to the rest of mankind. So in a certain sense, he is considered like the priest of mankind. He's a guide or a gatekeeper to mankind to basically show himself as a model for the kind of person that has to go to Olam Haba. God said to Avraham Avinu, "V'nivruchu b'cha," and in you shall be what? All the nations of the world will be blessed. So even though I've divided mankind into two different species, one who can create Olam Haba and only one who can reside in Olam Haba, but nevertheless, both elements of mankind are fundamentally connected. In other words, I did not abandon the Goyim. I simply renewed the contract with the Goyim to be a different type of people. And fundamentally, the function or the relationship of the Jews to the Goyim is that they have to be the model or the example to show the Goyim the destiny of spirituality and so on. They have to be the fundamental guide and the gatekeeper to the Goyim of the world, so they too can go to Olam Haba. And this, therefore, is the fundamental definition of the Jew. He can do it. Why? Because he is guaranteed Olam Haba. One way or another, he's guaranteed Olam Haba. But the Goy is not. But the Jew, through his example, can actually prefer this destiny on the Goyim as well. So this is the relationship between the two nations. The relationship of a Jew to a Goy is that the Jew is the bracha. He's a bracha and the Kohen, in a certain sense, to the Ummah Olam, to the nations of the world, so that they can go to Olam Haba. Now, fundamentally, the question is, what is the reality of this kind of relationship? And this is the point. What is the reality of this relationship? If the Jew fundamentally remains the gatekeeper to the Goyim, and it's up to him to provide an example for the Goyim in how to obtain a certain Kedusha which is connected to Olam Haba, in a certain sense, the Jew really is in danger. This is a very dangerous position. Why? Because he's an example and he's a model of what the Goyim should look like. Well, most people don't like to be criticized. And when they're criticized, even for their benefit, they get angry. And they get very angry at the one who criticized them and so on and so forth. So even though there's a mitzvah reichocha, a very powerful mitzvah reichocha, but of a reproof, that when a person sees another person sinning, he should mention it, he should instruct the other person on the proper behavior. But this presents a certain risk, because usually speaking, it's very possible to incur a certain wrath among the Goyim because of who the Jews represent and what they represent. Since fundamentally the essence of the Jews to be a model or a Mamlech Kohanim, a nation of priests, to all the peoples of the world, he's in a special category. And therefore he can incur the wrath of the nations of the world because they don't really want to listen to him. They don't want to hear what he has to say. They like Olam Hazeh, and they feel like staying it in forever if they can. So they don't want to be told that they're doing something wrong. They don't want to be told that the behavior that they're doing has to contain the element of kedusha. They don't want to know about that. It's not that they want to do bad things or they want to be tumah, but they want to relegate themselves to be permanently ensconced in the physical universe. They enjoy that, and they want that as their destiny. And when the Jews come along and tell them and show them the model of how to behave, let's say by the Ten Commandments, the Ten Commandments fundamentally is a very difficult proposition, because what it does is it puts a boundary on human behavior. It tells a person how to act and so on. It tells a person fundamentally that he has to respect and follow the destiny of two different sources. One, the relationship between him and God. He tells mankind that God himself, who created mankind, demands a certain type of behavior, a certain type of behavior which leads to a certain type of kedusha. So the Goyim probably don't want to hear this. They don't want to know this. And therefore they look at the Jew as the enemy. In addition, in the commandments also have to do with the relationship between man and man. They tell them to respect other men, to love other people, not to steal, not to kill, and so on. And the natural penchant for a person is therefore sometimes to do acts which are abominable and vicious. So mankind fundamentally as Goyim don't want to be curtailed in their behavior. Surely they don't want to be curtailed in their behavior by a Jew, and so on. So it would seem that the relationship of a Jew to Goy normally sparks the concept of anti-Semitism. There would be no anti-Semitism if the Jews were like everybody else. There would be no source or no cause for hatred on that score. Because the Jews, however, become a special people, they incite the Goyim to an anti-Semitic thing. So the question is, how could the Jews survive? That's the real question that has to be addressed to the Rabbi Shalom, to God, from the Jew. The problem is not so much the difficulty in being a Jew, in performing all those mitzvahs that have to do with a Jew. The problem is rather being someone who's a model, who should be an example to the nations of the world, and who puts himself at great risk while he's in that category. That's a very serious problem. So the question is, how does God himself intend to handle this? How does he intend to handle this risk that the Jew takes because he's a Goy Kodesh and a Mamlech Kohanim? And we see this clearly in human history, the tremendous amount of anti-Semitism and the hatred that the Goyim have for Jews and so on. The actuality that the reason why the Goyim have created basically some of their religions, mainly Christianity and Islam, is to remove the problem of the Jew. because both are fundamentally attempts to redefine the original mitzvahs. They will attempt to redefine mitzvahs in a certain sense so that it becomes more compatible with what they want. And since what they want, what Goyim want, is to be comfortable in a natural state in Olam Hazeh, that's their fundamental goal. They want to be comfortable in that. And they don't want to hear about this fact that Olam Hazeh is not the future place, but they have to work to a certain level of Kedusha to get to a higher place called Olam Haba. So what they did was create two religions, fundamentally, which come from Judaism, but they're a modification of Judaism. Whereas Judaism says the word no, Judaism or Torah or Tayyat Mitzvahs invent the word no. You have to control your behavior. You cannot do what you want because this is not your destiny. So what they invented is a modification of the word no. The Goyim refused to accept the word no, and they invented two new religions that include the word maybe. So in other words, for the Goyim, God says maybe. This is maybe you have to do these mitzvahs. But if you don't do these, God will totally forgive you, and so on and so forth. And they all both act on their own in any way they want. So this is the fundamental things. But the creation of both religions is not simply the desire of the Goyim to go against God. That's not simply true. But the desire in creating both of these religions was an attempt to really modify the Jewish directive that man is responsible for his behavior to God and to other men, and that appropriate behavior results in the destiny of Olam Haba. So we see that the attempt of the Goyim throughout history is to modify Judaism in any way they can. They want to be left alone. But that further puts them at risk, because if they keep on giving this message to the Goyim, the Jews are in danger. So how does God handle this? How does he handle the danger? This is the interesting question. And what he says is fundamentally this, and this is an incredible, a very important concept in the Torah. God says to the Jew that when you are a model to all of mankind, it's true, you will be at risk. But since you are performing my destiny, my task for you, I will protect you. In other words, anti-Semitism will never be created because you are performing what I want you to perform. That's right. God says that you will have a special protection from me, that they will never attack you or threaten you because you are doing this holy task. So the question is, when will they do that? When would the Ummah Olam, the nations of the world, the Goyim, actually attack the Jews, and so on? So God says this fundamental principle, which apparently most Jews don't really know or really understand. Because God says that the fundamental task of being a Mamlech Hanim is dependent on a certain concept, which is called an organism. You can only do this thing if you are modeled to the Goyim in a certain way. I not only want you to teach the Goyim the concept of Kedusha, and the concept of spirituality, but I want you to teach the Goyim the concept of loving one another, loving mankind. That mankind fundamentally is an organism. It's not a collection. Mankind is not a collection of individuals, but rather mankind is one body, and every person is a part of that body. Mankind, as such, is an organism, and therefore an organism is entitled to what? Is entitled to be loved. All the parts of the body are not strangers to each other. Could you please reduce the noise on the phone? Mankind is an organism. Therefore, they are a single body. And in an organism, the fundamental concept is that there's no such thing as a stranger. In the human body, for example, all these cells in the human body know each other. They are not strangers. They are completely knowledgeable. They know each other from the time that they started together, so that a person's body knows himself totally. Every cell knows every other cell in the body at all times. And he sees himself as a part of that team. An organism is a team of different components doing different jobs to accomplish the same goal or the same destination. And that goal is to live. And the human body, every cell of the human body conducts itself so that it makes the possibility of living. How do I know this? Because of the concept of what a transplant. When you put in a transplant into a person who needs a new organ, for example, if a person needs a new liver, and you give him a transplant of liver from another person, his body will reject that liver. Why? Because he says, even though it's a liver and I do need a liver, I want my liver. So he senses the identity of a liver as his liver. That means that it's not simply an organ, but it's an organ that belongs to him. It has his name on it, and that's the only type of organ. So therefore, the body rejects any organ that's coming from someone else that's not coming from him. So it's very difficult to initiate the concept of a transplant. Doctors have to give certain anti-rejection medications to allow the organism to absorb the functions of this new organism that originally belonged to someone else, a new organ that originally belonged to someone else. So this is the concept of what? This is the concept of what? Of mankind has to not only love God, but he has to love each other. And God says, your destination as a Jew is to demonstrate both of these truths, the love of God and the love of man. And the love of man includes the concept that mankind as a totality is an organism. And when you do that, when you carry my message in that way, by teaching mankind has to love each other, I therefore will always protect you. When you are one people, you will always be a safe people. But this is the thing, and this is the concept. If you do not do that, in other words, if you always fight amongst yourself, or you hate each other, or you act to each other in a criminal way, or whatever it is, you have what's called sinas chinam. Then that protection is gone in a certain way, because you are not doing the job as I intended it. You are not being a goy kodesh to mankind in the sense when you hate each other, because when mankind sees that there's a tremendous amount of disruption between the two of you, that when one Jew hates another Jew, or he has sinas chinam for no other reason at all, so he therefore will discount the message that he has to love me. He will not take your message as a Jew to be a priest among the nations of the world, because he will see by your behavior that you cannot be the representative of God, because you do not respect and even love each other. So therefore, the whole message that I want to give to mankind, where you are like an older brother to mankind, will be rejected as invalid, because you are simply not the people who can demonstrate this rule. So therefore, the only way that I will extend my hand over you and protect you to be safe, even though you're constantly in a certain way an example to mankind and somewhat critical of mankind, is if you stick together, if you are together, if you are considered as one organism. And this is the critical idea. So the Jews only create mankind as an enemy, as an anti-Semitic force, only when they have hate among themselves. When there is sinas chinam, and they have no respect and no love for each other, then the hand of God as a safety measure does not protect them anymore. And it literally generates a hatred of mankind. It's true, this does not really make any sense, because the Torah itself should generate the hatred of mankind. But God promises that this is not true. Mankind will never hate you when you also love yourselves amongst yourselves. When there's no sinas chinam, there is no sinas Yehudi at all. Sinas Yehudi, the hatred of a Jew, only becomes dependent on the Jewish behavior to each other, that's suddenly when the destiny of safety is not guaranteed. And this is something that the Jews don't realize. The Jews don't realize, and this is why I will say, nor has it ever been made clear to them, that their behavior amongst themselves determines the behavior of the Goyim to them directly. And when there is peace among the Jews, love among the Jews, there is not one anti-Semite in the world who will attack them. And when suddenly there's sinas chinam, there's unwarranted hatred of Jews, one to another, constant arguing, constant disagreeing with each other, and forcefully disagreeing with each other in a way, then that generates the hatred of the Goyim. And this is the promise of God himself. So this is the concept, how the Jews can protect themselves. Even though they have a risky job, because they have to be the representatives of all of mankind, they can heal themselves, they can see to it that this job is correct and sanctimonious only if by the way they relate to each other. So what do we see from this? We see a very powerful concept that is really a very difficult concept to understand. When we look at the last 2,000 years of human history, you see, the last 2,000 years, since the beginning of this alternative religions of Christianity and Islam, the hatred of the Goyim to Jews was in a different way. The Goyim were very angry at the Jews and so on. But their anger never really put itself to an anti-Semitism, because fundamentally anti-Semitism is the hatred of a Jew, not because of what he owns, or not because of what he has and so on, but it's a jealousy, it's an intrinsic jealousy of the Jewish people in terms of their destiny. The Goyim were never fearful of the Jews in terms of their destiny. The Goyim only saw the Jews as the people to conquer because of their possessions or their wealth. The Goyim would fight with the Jews and conquer Israel, but that was only to take away materially and physically what they had. But there never was actually a certain hatred of the destiny of the Jew in terms of who he is and what he has to do, until really intrinsically this was formed at the creation of certain of the Gentile religions. And suddenly the Gentiles, for the first time in history, actually competed with the Jews in terms of what their purpose was. This never occurred before. It's only with the creation of Christianity that the Gentiles suddenly said, no, we are the real Jews. That because of the sins of the Jews, God has abandoned the Jews. That's right, God has abandoned them to their ultimate purpose. And he has given the term Jew to a new people, a new destiny, to those who believe in the death of their Mashiach, Jesus, and so on and so forth, and become Christians. These people are now the new Jews. So therefore, it's the same thing with Islam in a certain sense. Islam is the creation of a new religion, and so on. And in Islam, they figured that the Jews were originally the chosen people of God to claim the destiny of instructing mankind. But this has changed. Now the Muslims, those who believe in Muhammad and his destiny, now are the new representatives of God in the world. So for the first time in the last 2,000 years, you had the creation of a new destiny where the Gentiles hate the Jews now because they have the same destiny as the Jews once had. They are the new Jews of the world. They represent God of the world. And the Jews have been canceled. They have been rejected and so on by God himself because of their sins. So this hatred that the Goyim have for the Jews is not simply because the Jews have a certain destiny or certain possessions. This hatred of the Jews is that the Jews no longer have their destiny at all. it was given away. It was taken away from them and given to the Goyim themselves. So therefore, automatically, the creation of these two new religions and so on became the very force of anti-Semitism itself. The reason why the Christians hate the Jews, because they're not Christians. They have not accepted the message of their Messiah. The reason why Muslims hate the Jews, because they're not Muslims. And they refuse to accept the message of Muhammad, the prophet. So now the Goyim oppose the Jews in their very essence of their destiny. So anti-Semitism is now part and parcel of the Goyim itself. Anti-Semitism before 2,000 years ago was a question of the Jews obtaining certain possessions and having certain things that the Goyim wanted. But now it's different. Now they hate the Jews, you see it? Not because of their possessions, but because of their destiny, because they maintain to be the chosen people of God to give mankind this message. And this is what's going on. So for the last 2,000 years, something new has been established that has never been established before. It's a kind of destiny which now is risky, tremendously dangerous, and it inspires many of the Goyim to attack Jews and kill them. And the Jews have lived for the last 2,000 years in such a deplorable state. So the question that we have to ask is, what's going on? Has God abandoned the Jews really? Has he really abandoned the Jews? And no longer intends to save them? But he doesn't say that in the Torah. God says that I will forever love the Jews, and I will forever promote their advancement spiritually and so on. And the Jews are forever have guaranteed Olam Haba. But how does God intend to bring this Olam Haba? Since the Jews are filled with sinas chinam, the main reason why the Messianic period did not start in the year 4000 with Rabbi Akiva ben Yosef, who was the actual Mashiach, is because of the sinas chinam of the Jews. And what happened? There were two fundamental events. That was that fundamentally their temple was destroyed, so the very access to Kedusha was removed from the midst of the Jewish people, the destruction of the temple 2,000 years ago, and also 2,500 years ago. But fundamentally, 2,000 years ago, the second temple was destroyed and never rebuilt. And the second thing that's happened to them is a continuous exile, with gradually all the Jews of the world and so on had to go from Israel to the nations of the world. They were exiled all over the world and so on, fundamentally to Europe and so on. So therefore, exile and the destruction of the temple became the new position of what the Jewish people had. So the real question is, what is the meaning of all that? What is the actual meaning of the last 2,000 years? That we have to exist in a certain abnormal state, a state without a temple, without the Kedusha of being near to God, and a state without the land. What does this new state really symbolize? So fundamentally, I want to say a certain chiddush that explains this, and it's very deep chiddush. It really explains a strange concept. But I believe this is the concept which really explains the behavior, what's been going on for the last 2,000 years, what God is doing, even with the existence of sinas chinam, unwarranted hatred between the Jews. Clearly, because the Jews have so much enmity among themselves, as is stipulated in the Gemara, God has reduced their destiny. He has reduced their destiny. And therefore, they no longer have the true protective hand of God himself. But even more than that, it seems to be that even Olam Haba, the actual destination of the Jewish people, has fundamentally altered. Because it seems to be that there are two different Olam Habas, not one. For the majority of Jews who lived for the last 2,000 years, there seems to be a change in Olam Haba itself, in the sense that they don't have a Beis HaMikdash anymore, so they do not have an instrument which is Machapa or atones for the Jewish people, and they no longer live in the land of Israel. So therefore, at least half of the mitzvahs in the Torah was suddenly canceled. They're no longer applicable. You cannot do any of the sacrifices in the temple. The whole avodah of the Kohanim, the whole service of the priests, of the Kohanim class, and so on and so forth, is no longer possible. We have no Beis HaMikdash. We cannot bring sacrifices or anything. Not only that, the second thing that has been canceled are the mitzvahs have to do with Eretz Yisrael, because the Jews were exiled all over the world. They do not live fundamentally in Eretz Yisrael. So a lot of the mitzvahs, for example, a lot of the mitzvahs like Shemitah and Yovel and so on, and the Matnas, Aniyim, many of these mitzvahs are no longer applicable. There are certain mitzvahs that can only be performed in Eretz Yisrael. And if you are not in Eretz Yisrael, in the land of Israel, you cannot do these mitzvahs. So at least half the mitzvahs in the Torah are no longer applicable. So what does this mean? What did this do to the spirituality of the Jewish people? How did this affect their Olam Haba? So what I would like to say is that there are two different types of Olam Haba. There's the Olam Haba of the individual, and there's the Olam Haba not of the individual, but also of the organism. Two different concepts of Olam Haba. And what do I mean? Every Jew has to do a certain amount of mitzvahs and so on. So if the majority of his deeds in his life are mitzvahs, most of his life is composed of, in the acts of free will, through mitzvahs, then he is said to be, that's considered a yasher, that's considered a righteous person. And therefore, when he goes to Olam Haba, he has Olam Haba as an individual. But fundamentally, Olam Haba is focused on him. He is an inhabitant of the eternal world. And the eternal world is expressed through his consciousness. Each Jew in Olam Haba has a consciousness of a being in Olam Haba. So Olam Haba is actually not a location, it's not a place, it's a state. It's a state of consciousness which lasts forever, and so on, outside of time and space in that sense. And it lasts forever. But fundamentally, the locus of Olam Haba, or the fundamental position of Olam Haba, or the center of Olam Haba, is the individual. And he has earned that, and so on, by the majority of his deeds. And that's why it says, when it says in the Torah, Acharei Rabim lahatos, we always follow the majority. If there's a controversy in halacha, and so on, we follow the majority. We go after most of the Rabbanim. That's the thing. And that's halacha really applies to the destiny of a Jew. Acharei Rabim lahatos, we follow the majority of his deeds. That's how a person is judged, by the majority of his deeds. So if the majority of his deeds relate to Kedusha because of the performance of mitzvahs, therefore he goes to Olam Haba. Olam Haba becomes a state of his mind. That's what he experiences in Olam Haba. Olam Haba is an individual experience for each person who has earned it through the majority of his deeds. But let's say that the majority of deeds are not mitzvahs. Or let's say that the Jew no longer has all the mitzvahs. Let's say that at least half the Torah is no longer available because it's no longer applicable, because the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed, or because or else he lives in exile. So he cannot do many of the mitzvahs in the Torah. What then becomes his Olam Haba? So Olam Haba, I believe, is redefined as not simply belonging to the individual, but being part of the position of a class. It belongs to the organism. That's right. It's a consciousness which belongs to the organism as an organism itself. And since this person is still part of the organism, he appreciates and experiences the greatness of Olam Haba. But through his association with the Jewish people as an organism, he benefits from Olam Haba. So Olam Haba, in a certain sense, is not the property of the individual as such, but it's the property of the organism. And anyone who's attached to Klal Yisrael because he's Jewish, and in some way does some mitzvahs, is able to go to Olam Haba. The guarantee still extends to him because he's Jewish, but it really extends to the organism, to Klal Yisrael, to the Malachos Kahanim of the world. And he's able to participate in Olam Haba. Why? Because he is part of that organism, part of that general class. The higher, that is a lower level of Olam Haba. Olam Haba that applies to an organism, to the Klal, is lower in Madregen level than the Olam Haba that applies to. So therefore, there's a very big difference between the Olam Haba of Jews, in a certain sense, before this temple was destroyed and before they were exiled, to the Jews after the temple was destroyed and after they were in the state of exile. The difference. Now, fundamentally, you cannot really define it precisely, but what I can say that it really is the association of Olam Haba is different for these two types of Jews. For the Jew who is an individual, the Jew who is a person with the temple, who lives in Eretz Yisrael with the temple, earns his Olam Haba as an individual. And Olam Haba, therefore, is the fundamental state of the individual. But after this temple was destroyed, and after he goes in exile, he is no longer an individual. He is really a Jew as part of a class. He's part of an organism, strictly speaking. And therefore, that even changes the definition of for himself. Now, how do we see this? Why do I think that this is true? I'm saying a very Chiddush, which I believe to be true, that there's a difference between the Olam Haba of the individual and the Olam Haba of the organism, or the class, and how a person obtains his Olam Haba. But the question is, how do I know this? And why do I say this? And what's the reason that I actually prefer this particular argument? And there's something very deep going on here. There's at least two observations that I want to make, which are fundamentally unknown. There are two things that God is doing that fundamentally is basically unknown, but yet is the fundamental cause, is the fundamental definition of this new state of Olam Haba. And what do I mean, this new state of Olam Haba? The Olam Haba that belongs to the organism, not the Olam Haba that belongs to the individual. So God changed fundamentally the principle. The operating principle used to be Acharei Rabim Lahatos. We always go after the majority. And that the deeds of an individual for the majority are mitzvahs. His Olam Haba is therefore defined by his personality, his achievements. But God changed that rule. That's right. What do I mean by change the rule? He changed the rule so that even a Jew who doesn't do so many mitzvahs, and even doesn't live in Eretz Yisrael, and does not have anything to do with the Beis HaMikdash, he also has an Olam Haba, which means that the new concept is Acharei the Miyat Lahatos, that God now follows the minority of his deeds, the minimum amount necessary to go into Olam Haba, which is a minority. God no longer judges him by the majority of his deeds, but he judges him by his new location. You see it, in exile and without a temple. And therefore, God is really looking at the Jewish people in terms of the minority, the miyut of his mind now determine his destiny in Olam Haba. Not the roiv of his maisim, the majority of his deeds, but the miyut, by the minimal aspect of what he's doing. That's right. There's a new concept, a new position of Olam Haba that's based on the concept of niyut. It's not based on the concept of Rabim. And why do I say this? Because there's something we see that's been going on for the last 2,000 years. It's not simply that the temple is destroyed, and it's not simply that we are in exile. It's much worse than that. It's the concept of safety. We see a strange concept called safety. The Jew is no longer safe. Whereas he was safe when he was in the land of Israel and had the temple. He was safe. He was a denizen of his own country. He was in a land of Kedusha. But now the Jew is no longer in that situation. The Jew lives fundamentally all over the world. He's in exile. He has no real identity. And only recently, in 1948, he established the country of Israel, where he finally went back home. But even that's not really where he belongs. Because his residence in Israel now, even though he is the land of Israel, but Israel is not the nation, really, of Jews. It's the nation of Jewish people who are in exile. The Jews still are in exile. Even the Jews who live in Israel are in exile. Why? Because fundamentally, without God, without the Kedusha of 630 mitzvahs and so on, without the centrality of Kedusha or holiness, the Jewish people are really in exile. Because even though the Jewish people have moved from the Goyish nations like Europe and North America and South America and from other countries in the world, even though they've moved physically into the land of Israel, they have not taken the Torah with them. Their soul is not yet really Jewish. Even though ethnically they are Jews and halachically they are Jews, they are not spiritually true Jews, because most of the Jewish people are not religious at all and barely have any kind of belief in God. Not only the Jews in Israel, actually, they honor and they revere what? They don't revere the holy places. The Rabbi, the place where the temple stood, is not revered by the Jews. That's right. It's revered by the Arabs. The Arabs actually control the holiest place in the Jewish religion, the Rabbi, the Temple Mount. And the Jews allow this. Incredibly, they allow the Goyim, the Arabs in this case, to actually occupy the Temple Mount. And they put up with it. They accede to this because they don't want to damage their relationship with the Goyim of the world, because they don't want to incite the Goyim of the world. They don't want to incite the Arabs and the Goyim of the world. So they say, okay, so you have it. You have our Temple Mount. It's considered your Temple Mount. But the Arabs have no real relationship to the Temple Mount. You know, all of the myth, the Temple Mount is not even mentioned in the Quran. You know what I mean? At all. So they really have no relationship to the Temple Mount. But we accede to them. We give it to them. We say, you can have it. You can take care of it. What? Is this possible? Or the Ma'as HaMachpelah, the cave of Machpelah, which the patriarchs of the Jews are buried in, and so on. They aren't. They are not dominated by the Jews. They are dominated by the Arabs. The Arabs control Hebron, the Ma'as Machpelah. And we allow that. We have given them permission to take over our holy places. So what does that say about a Jew living in Israel? He lives in Israel in body, but his soul is not in Israel. His soul is in exile, is with the nations of the world. So therefore, even though we are back in the land of Israel, we only in physical form. It's a completely irreligious state. It's a state which does not sanctify its holy places, which tolerate the Ummah Ha'olam, the Goyim, to dominate these places and to inhabit these places. So what does it mean that the Jew is back in the land of Israel? This is not the land of Israel that I know. It's not the land of Israel that the Torah talks about. Israel is fundamentally now the land of the Goyim. Still is. As much as they occupied the holy places before the temple was destroyed, or as much as they occupied the temple before the Goyim destroyed it, and before they lived what they lived in Israel, they don't live in now. And their soul does not reside. So what does this mean? What is this state? It's a kind of an interim state. Is this the Geula? Yes and no. It's the Geula in the sense that the Jews have returned to Israel. But their soul has not returned to Israel. So therefore, we are still in exiles. We are in the same exile as we were before we went into exile itself. We are still in the exile of the last 2,000 years. So the question is, what does this mean? What does this do to our Olam Haba? And what is God doing to save us? What exactly is the program of the last 2,000 years? Well, now that we realize that the fundamental issue and the problem with Jews is safety, we are not safe anymore. We live among the Goyim who hate us, who oppose us in their religions, who consider us the dark spot on the planet Earth of mankind. We live amongst them. We persevere amongst them. We are not safe at all, and so on. And because of our sinners sinning with each other, because we continuously argue with each other, we fight with each other, we condemn each other, we hold each other in contempt, this situation remains. So what exactly is God doing now? So God, therefore, has done a new thing. He has created a new concept of Yisrael. The Jewish people are not only people who are supposed to keep the Taryag mitzvahs, and they're supposed to come up to a madrega of Kedusha and so on and so forth. And since they're supposed to also love each other and be respectful of each other, God has redefined Ahavas Yisrael. Ahavas Yisrael means literally the love of one Jew to another, according to the verse, V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. But God has redefined Ahavas Yisrael. That Ahavas Yisrael is not when one Jew loves another, but when two Jews suffer because they are Jews. In other words, when the Jewish people suffer because of their Judaism, because they are brothers, and they are both oppressed and persecuted because of that, irregardless of what their relationship is. It could be that organismically the Jews are one people, but sociologically they're not. Many people. They're composed of many people. But God says, I will redefine Ahavas Yisrael, not when the Jews love each other indeed, but when the Jews suffer with each other in a common way. So even though they hate each other, they are all suffering because they're Jews. And that unity of suffering is one thing that still keeps the Jewish people as an organism. That's right. The definition of an organism of the Jewish people is the fact that they suffer together and they are persecuted together, not as individuals, but as a people, as a doctrine. That's what it is. And God says, this is the new Madrega in Ahavas Yisrael. This is the new definition of an organism. In other words, when people will hate the Jews, they will hate them as a totality. They will hate them as a group. Sinner scheming will now be addressed. It will now be targeted to the people of Israel because they are the people of Israel. And that is the new definition of Ahavas Yisrael. That at least if the Jews suffer together and are persecuted, there will be an aspect of a unity. That will be a certain aspect of the relationship of Jews to other. In a certain sense, I will substitute the Yisurin of Klal Yisrael as a group for the Ava of Klal Yisrael that they should have had. And therefore, I will now protect them on that basis because they're only suffering. So to some extent, we see what's going on in the last 2,000 years. that the tikkun of Klal Yisrael, the definition of the mitzvah of Avos Yisrael, is now when the Jews suffer together. Because since they're suffering together, because why? They're suffering because they are Jews, because they hold the Torah, or at least they believe in the Torah and so on. Because of that, that's why they're suffering. So in other words, what gives the Klal Yisrael its kedusha is simply anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is an instrument of the Bnei Shalom, that it describes the achdus of Klal Yisrael. So when you say, in the last 2,000 years, how are the Jews considered one people? How? They have so much sin and sin among them. What God says to you, they are one people because they always suffer. They are persecuted as a single people because of their religion, because of their identity, and so on. So therefore, they suffer in common. And that is the new madrega of the organism. That's the new madrega. What used to be Avos Yisrael is now the Yisurin of Klal Yisrael. The common anti-Semitism, which is directed at them, is now their definition. It's the definition of their organism. And we see this. What's happened? In the last 70 years ago, there was a Holocaust. And they were suffering against the Nazis. But the Nazi suffering, the Nazi persecution was completely different than all the other persecutions of the Jews. Because Hitler hated the Jew as a Jew. He hated the Jew because of the Ten Commandments. There was once a reporter that said to Hitler, "Why do you hate the Jews so much?" And Hitler said, "I hate them because what the Jews have done, they have destroyed mankind, because they say that mankind's will is up to God, that the Jews have to follow, be obedient to God. And therefore, with their 10 commandments, because they have given the 10 commandments to the world, they have destroyed the free will and the independence of mankind from God himself. And that's why I hate them." Hitler hated the Jews because of their soul. So that's why Hitler said that a Jew has to be identified and killed and destroyed, even as far back as several generations, if several generations before his mother was Jewish. He did not care what kind of Jew he was. He did not care if he was an Ashkenazi, or if he was a Sephardi, if he was a Misnagid, or if he was a Chassid. Nothing. The only concern that Hitler had was that he was Jewish, and that's why I hate him, and that's why, and therefore as a representative of God and the Torah, I have to annihilate him. So Hitler, in a certain sense, the anti-Semitism of the Germans, their anti-Semitism had, in a certain sense, the greatest, it allocated the greatest kedusha to Klal Yisrael. That's right. I'm saying something which is impossible to understand. That in the instance when he killed 6 million Jews, why? Because they were Jewish, man, child, infant. When he killed them all because of that, because of their soul, this was the greatest act of kedusha, according to the new definition of what a Jew is. Because the Jews at that time died in such a way, totally, in the most obscene way. But why? Because of his anti-Semitism, the German anti-Semitism, because he was Jewish. So according to the new definition of what a Mamlechas Kohanim is, they reached the highest madrega of Mamlechas Kohanim. No longer is a nation of priests a nation of Kedusha. A nation of priests is a nation who suffers together. And the Holocaust was the greatest incident in human history of Jewish suffering as a people, as their soul. And according to the new definition of what a Jew is, this was the highest madrig of Kedusha. And that's why right after the Holocaust, we suddenly got Eretz Yisrael. In a certain way, certain aspects of the Geula became true. We went back to Eretz Yisrael. We gained. So even the nations of the world finally said, you can have Israel back. You can have the land of Israel back. But how do we earn it? How do we earn to get the land of Israel back after being exiled from it for 2,000 years? You know how we earned it? Because we accomplished the highest madrega of Mamlechas Kohanim. How? Through the Yisuin of the Holocaust, by being murdered and destroyed in such a way only because of our soul, not because of our individual personalities. We reached the highest level of Kedusha that a Jew can have in the last 2,000 years. It's bizarre. You could say, this is bizarre. But this is what God did because of the redefinition of what the Mamlech Shimon is, the redefinition of Ahavas Yisrael. So that's we can understand in a certain sense why the conclusion of the Holocaust led to the beginning of the Geula, the beginning of entering Eretz Yisrael and living in Eretz Yisrael as a Jewish country. We finally had to die at the highest level of the anti-Semitism possible for the nations of the world so that we can finally return to our status and begin to go back to the Geula. For the last 2,000 years, every instance of Christian and Muslim persecution was an insignia of Kedusha to us. They hated us. And for the last 2,000 years, they continuously killed us and so on, and destroyed us. There was continuously anti-Semitism. God knows if you read a book on anti-Semitism and on the history of anti-Semitism, it is absolutely mind-boggling the levels of Jewish persecution that we experience. From the Crusades to the Inquisition to the pogroms and so on, and finally to the Holocaust, we have experienced more death from the hands of the Goyim than any time in our history. Yet, what can you say about that? That's the definition of Ahavas Yisrael. That's the definition of Ahavas Yisrael. The new definition that the people who suffer together are together. It's not the people who love each other are together. That used to be the definition. But God has accepted our sinas chinam as part of our avodah. One of the ways we obey God and worship God is through our suffering. The Jews have always wondered, why do we suffer so? Those people on earth, they're like the garbage of the world, because that garbage is the holiest place to be. When the Goyim hate us, so therefore we atone for the fact that we hate ourselves. You should know something. If you had a scale, and on one side of the scale, you put every instance when a Goy persecuted a Jew, either killed him or robbed him or hated him, every instance in human history when the Goy hated a Jew for whatever reason, but especially because of our definition, our soul. On the other side of the scale, you know what you have? You have every instance when a Jew hated another Jew. That's right. It's zelu mazeh. It's equal, exactly. The amount of hatred that the Goyim have experienced in the way they hate us is equal to the amount of experience that we have in the way we hate each other. That's right. We don't have one incident where suddenly a Goy hates the Jew when a Jew did not hate another Jew. It's always equal. The two scales are always equal. So God has substituted, we say, sinas Yisrael, sinas chinam, with sinas hagoyim, with anti-Semitism, and that's the new earmark of Kedusha. That allows us to survive as the Jews. That allows us to go to the Olam Haba, even with these levels of sinas chinam. Because anti-Semitism has been converted into the instrument of Kedusha and the instrument of Geula, as we see in the Holocaust. Now, there's another thing that's happened in the last 2,000 years that also has never been before. Not in these terms. Well, we see something besides the anti-Semitism. We see the cruelty invested on the Jews by the Goyim. We see that. And what does that mean? That changes our perception of God. It does. There's a certain strange phenomena that's going on for hundreds of years in the Jews. I'm not exactly sure how long it's been going on, but it's been going on for a long time. In the shuls where we daven, a great deal of the time, people talk. In fact, there's certain movements now that try and stop the talking in shuls. But Jews are known for that. They're known for talking. They talk about business, they talk about pleasures, or they talk about experiences. They talk in shul. While the chazan is davening, while they're reading the Torah, Jews are talking, and so on. So it's almost like the shul has become a social club. It's not only a place where people daven, but chiefly what goes on is talking, schmoozing, social activity. And the question is, why? This is a very strange thing. It's a very strange phenomenon. If you look at the activity of Goyim, you will never see that when they are worshiping God in any form, in their form of Avodah Zorah, in their churches, in their mosques, you will never see the talking. Why are the Jews so different? Why do they talk when they're supposed to daven? Why do they exhibit such a disrespect for God? And God has told us how angry he is when they do this in a certain sense. In fact, one of the reasons for the Khmelnytsky pogroms of the 1600s, when the Cossacks, Ukrainians, killed the Jews at that time, the Tosfos Yontif says that that's the reason because of talking in shul. In the 1600s, the Khmelnytsky pogrom, which wiped out 1/3 of European Jewry, especially in the Eastern European countries and so on, was the Tosfos Yontif says that was because of the talking in shul. But this phenomenon does not exist among any other religion. Even idol worship, when people, the ancient Egyptians did their idol worship, there was tremendous decorum and tremendous respect, which we also had when the Beis Hamikdash was there, basically. But fundamentally, in the last 2,000 years, we don't have that anymore. Since the Beis Hamikdash is destroyed, we have this kind of social behavior. And people are telling Yourself, it's one of the worst sins you can do. But you know what I maintain? It's not one of the worst sins you can do. That's right. Why? Why do I say that? And the fact is, God really holds us accountable because we have turned the shuls into a social club? Not really. Why do I say that? It's a very big chiddush, and not really. Because God understands why the Jews have turned the shul into a social club. He does. He understands why. And no one else really understands why. So I'm going to tell you the reason that I believe he understands that, and so on. Now, of course, chas v'sholom, I'm not promoting the idea that the Jews should turn a shul into a social club, chas v'sholom. But I'm trying to give you an explanation why they do that. Because it is a highly disrespectful act. It says on the Oren HaKodesh, Da lifnei mi ato omed. Know who you're standing in front of. That's what it says on the Oren in the So the thing is, you have to know that when you daven in shul, you are talking to the master of the universe, the master of creation itself, the master of existence, whose name is the Shem Havaya, to be. And that's who you're talking to. And you have to understand, when you have an audience with him, you should be stone-faced. You should be so careful about what you say and what you do, because you are talking about the greatest being who ever exists. And yet we have turned the shul where we daven, where we're supposed to devote ourselves to worshiping him, to make him into a social club. So the question is, why? Are the Jews stupid? Don't they understand what they're doing? So I will provide an answer where I will tell you that God does understand that. He does understand what he's doing and why they do that. And he takes that into account. And why? What is the thing? What's going on? Because fundamentally, the Jews have lost one of the key concepts of Yiras Shamayim. There are two concepts of Yiras Shamayim: Emunah, the belief in God's power, his dominant power, his sovereignty, and that's called emunah. That you believe that God is God and is the ultimate ein oid milvado. There's no power but Him. That's called emunah. But there's something called betochen. Betochen means commandi ovid lachman latav ovid. Whatever God does is for the best. That's right, it's the best. So then we believe betochen means we believe in God's goodness. We not only believe in God's power, what He can do, and so on, and we believe also in His goodness, that His kavanah, His intent, is to do good. In fact, that's what God says. Whatever I do is good. You have to trust me, and so on. But fundamentally, the last 2,000 years has eroded our belief in betochen, because we see so much anti-Semitism. The Jews have suffered so much by the anti-Semitism of the Goyim that they do not see God's goodness anymore. They see it's terrible. Could you imagine what a Jew must have felt about God after the Holocaust? You can say what you want. You can say, well, they still believe that God is doing this, whatever you want to say. But you know what it is to witness in your lifetime an event called the Holocaust? Because the Holocaust was not simply an event of murder. No, it wasn't. It wasn't murder. Murder is much simpler. Murder is when you go over to a person and you shoot them in the head. But the Holocaust was a situation where Adolf Hitler, the Nazis did not shoot the Jews in the head. What they did was they suffocated the Jews, asphyxiated in gas chambers, and then they went and they put them in ovens and they burnt them to ashes, and then they buried the ashes. Did you ever hear of such a thing? Such a contempt? The contempt of the Nazis for the Jews is indicated by the way they treated them. Not in a normal case of murder. You go and you shoot a person in the head, quick, it's done. But they didn't do that. These people agonized and they were asphyxiated. And then after that, and some of them were actually still alive probably, they were thrown into an oven and burnt to a crisp and made into ashes, and then they were buried. The act of contempt of such a deed is shocking. In fact, in one of the concentration camps, which I once visited, I think it was Majdanek, there was a bathtub outside of the crematoria, and the bathtub was the pipes in the crematoria that led from the oven to the bathtub. And the commandant of the concentration camp used to take a bath. He used to heat the water of the bathtub with the ash, with the flames of Jews being consumed in the ovens. Now, you can't get worse than that. That is the ultimate contempt of a Jew, the ultimate persecution and derision and derogation and so on of a person is to treat him like fuel. Fuel. He is the fuel to heat up a person's bathtub, the water in the bathtub. It doesn't get lower than that. So therefore, the Jews have witnessed this for 2,000 years. From the Christian anti-Semites, the pogroms at the time of the plague, the Black Death and so on. And when the Crusaders used to go to Israel, the Gentiles, they used to go to Israel to take back Jerusalem from the Muslims. As they passed through Europe, as Germans and French and English passed through Europe to go down to the Mediterranean Sea to cross over to Israel, they used to kill Jews by the thousands. You have no idea of the brutality of how they exercise their anti-Semitism. None. They would break into a Jewish community, into a ghetto, and they would slaughter every Jew there. They would slaughter the men, the women, and the children like they were trash, like they were garbage. And this was going on for thousands of years. That's what the anti-Semitism of the Goyim produced. And now we see that this anti-Semitism had a kedusha to it. That's right. It had a kedusha because the Jews now lived in these lands. They didn't go to these lands as tourists. They lived in these Goyish lands in Europe, in Spain, in Africa, and so they lived in these lands. So they had to experience this anti-Semitism. Any day that you lived in the Jewish ghetto in the Middle Ages or before, in the Middle Ages or the medieval period, or even after, and so on, you were always afraid that that day there would be another pogrom. That was your fear. There was no concept of guaranteed safety. There's almost never a king or an emperor in the Goyish countries that had any respect for Jews, that saw them in any other way but garbage. You do not understand what they lived at. So the question is, how does that affect your Yiras Shamayim? Really? Do you see God as good? You can barely not judge God. Fundamentally, when you look at what God has done for the last 2,000 years, fundamentally you will begin to believe that he's some kind of terrible being that's brought a plague and a terrible makkah, a terrible or pain to Jewish people in a way that he has not brought to other people. So therefore, this Jew has experienced constant anti-Semitism from the Goyim. And therefore, what's his belief in God? Does he see God as Komandi Ovid Rachman or Tav Ovid? No. What goodness? What does he see in his life that's good? Everything has to be measured by the fact that next day, tomorrow, he can be killed. So how does he see God as a judge? Well, he still does the mitzvahs, to a large extent the Jews who are really religious. And this is remarkable, absolutely remarkable, that the Jews have such faith in God, at least in his judgments, and they don't really blame God truly, in a certain sense, that all this has taken place. But there has to be some kind of effect. This had to have affected the behavior of Jews. And how do you, how example, that Jews after a while assimilated, because assimilation was a measure of safety. If you suddenly assimilated in a country and you became a goy, mazel tov, you're safe. You're not that hated Jew. So that's why many Jews became fry. They became assimilationists. They intermarried with the goyim. Why? Fundamentally, they did that not simply because they wanted to live the life of goyim. They did that because they wanted to be safe. And the safest way is to join the goyim. So, because if you become a goy, that is your safety. That is your safety switch. And that's one reason why Jews don't keep the Torah at all, to be safe. Even the Jews in America who have joined the left and progressives, even they do a lot of that. They join the goyim simply because, why is it that the Jews like leftism? Why? Because leftism is safe. It should be safe. It's not. But they believe it's safe. If you become a goy, if you become a left and a liberal, where you don't believe in any values, any moral values, you don't believe in God or anything, so you're really safe. Because there's no one judging you. Nobody hates you because you're Jewish. It knows you're a human being and we will respect you. Liberals say they respect everyone. Of course they don't, but they say that. And therefore, they say, if you become one of us, we will love you, we will honor you, we will protect you. And that's why many of the Jews become liberals. Why are so many Jews, why do they join the Democratic Party? Because the Democratic Party is a party, what do you call it, which rejects fundamental values or principles. So their main value is that people have to be free and do whatever they want. They can do anything they want sexually. They can change their gender and so on. Homosexuals are allowed. Transgender are allowed. Anything goes. They don't have to go to church. They don't have to do anything. You know, they just have to be nice to each other. So the Jew says, hey, I'll sign up on that. You know, that's safer than being Jews. So therefore we see that a great deal of assimilation comes from the fact of safety. And it also explains the fact why the Jews talk in shul. Because they talk in shul because they are angry. That's right. Whether they tell you or not, Jews are angry. And who are they angry at? God. Because they see what's happening. They see the last 2,000 years. They know full well what God has done to them. He has put them into what? He has put them into a boiling pot of water. That's right. And they are busy cooking. They are being cooked. Because as long as they live in the exile of the Goyim, they are cooked. They are in danger. They could die. They, their wife, their family, everyone they love, everyone in the community, the rabbis, everyone could be killed by Goyish anti-Semitism, who is the majority of the country, and so on. And having realized that, their respect for God has gone down. And God knows that. The Jews fundamentally talk in shul because they are passive-aggressive. You know what passive-aggressive means? When you're angry at something and you demonstrate to the person that you're angry at him, that's called active aggressiveness. But when you hate someone, when you don't like someone, or you're angry at someone, and you don't want them to know that you're angry at them. For example, when you and with your family member have to go to a wedding and so on, and the family member is always late, or that your family member knows what you want but never gives it to you. That's called passive aggressive, because the person who's doing this to you doesn't say that he's angry at you. No. He says, well, this is just what I do, but it's not. He's doing it also with the unconscious feelings that he's resentful. So therefore, the Jews talking in shul is not simply socializing. It's resentment. It's resentment against this position they put in. The Jews don't normally talk about that because they don't want to admit that they resent God. And therefore they talk in shul. It becomes a social club. How could you talk about it in a place which is the center of worship? No, because we resent God, because what God has done to us. For the last 2,000 years, we are crumbling under this oppression. Of course. And God knows this. God knows that this is the reason. It's their attitude about Him that they feel. He understands it. And He accommodates them for it. He trusts me. I believe God thoroughly understands this. And in a certain way, He can't blame them. Because it's a terrible position to be in, to live among people who hate you and want to destroy you. It's a terrible place to be. How many times did the Goyim prohibit the Jews from doing certain professions or certain businesses? The reason why the Jews became lenders is because that was about the only thing that they can do. They had to open up banking systems because banking was one of the few enterprises that they were allowed. They were forbidden to practice any kind of craftsmanship skills. They were forbidden to be professionals. They were forbidden to be doctors or lawyers or anything. So the only thing left to them was certain types of practices which are not really that kosher. And that got them even more problems, because now that the Goyim borrowed money from them, the Goyim wanted to relieve themselves of the debt. The fastest way to relieve yourself of a debt, which is probably had to do with a Jew, is to kill him. And that's the end of the debt. That's what they did in York, in England, where they killed hundreds of Jews. Because many of them were owned, they owed, the Goyim owed them money. The fastest way to clear that debt is to get rid of the bankers, get rid of the creditors. So the anti-Semitism of the Goyim has been horrendous. So that's why the Jews talk in shul. That's the passive-aggressive way they termed their disrespect. And God fully understands this. But He had to do this, God. Why? Because the Jews refused to respect themselves. They refused to be careful with themselves, not to speak lashon hara or chidus, not to have unwanted hatred, not to be jealous of each other, not to constantly judge each other. So God therefore had to initiate a new of Avos Yisrael, that the Jew who suffers together is, I will consider that the Jew who loves each other. That's right. Since you can't be proper to each other and respectful and love each other, therefore you will at least die together. That will be the new glue of this organism called the Jewish people. So how has this affected Jews? Of course it's affected the religion. Of course it's affected the religion in the sense that they don't respect God in the true sense. And it's very difficult to understand what God wants or what God is doing and so on. But God is fundamentally saving them. That's right. By redefining Achsos, God has saved the Jewish people. Unfortunately, this is a very painful form of saving. It's like going to surgery without anesthesia. But this does something very important. You know what? When you are put in a situation where you are angry at God and so on, so what does that do? What is your Yir Shemayim? So an amazing thing happens. When a Jew is still from, or a Jew still keeps mitzvahs, in other words, when a Jew still exhibits certain behaviors of liking another Jew, of taking care of another Jew, when a Jew does certain mitzvahs, even though he's angry at God, that means that the value of that mitzvah increases. You see, when a Jew has no kindness against God, then his mitzvahs are important, but they're not as important. But when the Jew is angry at God and still keeps mitzvahs, then the few mitzvahs he keeps is very precious to God. Because God is saying to the Satan, to the accusing angel, you see, look at these people. Even though I have to redefine Jewish love, I have to redefine philo-Semitism, loving Jews, and I have to define the Jews as people who suffer together, but still see how they do the mitzvahs. They still do mitzvahs of chesed and mitzvahs of loving kindness in a certain level. They still take care of each other up to a certain level. There's still a certain loyalty that they have to each other. And this loyalty that they have to each other is extremely precious, even though it's few and far in between. So this submits the concept. This is the concept of what? Of acharei miyut lahatos. In other words, the Jews has been turned into minimalists. They are no longer maximalists where they're allowed to be in the temple, to bring korbanos and do many mitzvahs in Eretz Israel. They are minimalists. They are only allowed to do certain mitzvahs that exist, that are left over. But God says, these Jews are doing these mitzvahs even though I am acting in a harmful way to them. Even though they can barely understand what I'm doing, that I am extremely judgmental. They think that I'm harming them, but I'm really saving them. Anti-Semitism saves the Jew. Anti-Semitism is the new form of Avos Yisrael, and I'm saving him. So therefore, it's the merit of what he's doing. It's the fact that he's doing so few mitzvahs, even though he's surrounded by so much. So therefore, the quality of those mitzvahs is much greater than normal. One mitzvah which is done in danger is equivalent to 100 which are not done in danger. So there's a whole new criteria where the value of each mitzvah explodes. It's no longer the mitzvah you used to do when you were not in danger. These mitzvahs that you do, this Yir Shemayim that you have, whatever level is left that you do now, is extremely precious. It's extremely valuable. So God says, I understand. You're being passive aggressive, and I understand that. Because I have redefined Avos Yisrael. But I have to do that to save you. I have to turn your Olam Haba into an Olam Haba of an organism. Because fundamentally what God is saying to the Jews who in the last 2,000 years, this is not the Olam Haba of an individual. What depends on how many mitzvahs you do, how much you keep Shabbos. This is not what this is. This Olam Haba depends on the mitzvahs, which are extremely precious. You can accomplish a certain level of Olam Haba by doing certain mitzvahs, even though you have this attitude to me. I recognize that. The criteria of Olam Haba of the last 2,000 years is unlike the criteria of Olam Haba before. Before, Olam Haba was an individual affair. Now Olam Haba is what? Is an affair of the organism. All you Jews are suffering together. So therefore, Olam Haba is the position of the organism, the totality of the Jew. And you, in being part of the Jewish people, even in such a time, this will be your Olam Haba, and it will be a good Olam Haba also. Maybe not as great as the one for individuals, because their behavior was much more exemplary. But your behavior is not as exemplary, but I will still save you as an organism. You will suffer as an organism. Everyone will hate you as an organism, and that will be your Olam Haba. That's your fundamental thing, because this not only allows you, so not only atones for the sin of Chinam. These mitzvahs are now much more precious to me, but they're only precious in the sense that these are the last mitzvahs you're holding on to, and therefore, in my mind, God says these are the most precious of all. And surely you will Olam Haba by your minimal behavior, not your maximal behavior. Minimally you will Olam Haba as a group. And that's the Olam Haba of what we see today, and we see for hundreds and hundreds of years before. I believe that God has changed the definition of B'malach Kohanim. And either way he's saving them. Either when they love each other, he saves them by protecting them against any anti-Semite. And even when they do not like each other, they are very bad to each other. He protects them through the anti-Semitism by their suffering. But then the Olam Haba becomes an Olam Haba of an organism, not an individual. So I believe that this is what's going on. This is why the avoid of Klal Yisrael of the last 2,000 years, of the Yemoshe Mashiach, because truly the Yemoshe Mashiach has already started. The Mashiach has come. The Mashiach was Rabbi Akiva ben Yosef. And the Jews of the last 2,000 years have suffered tremendously, and that suffering has been their avodah, has been their kedusha, and is also their Olam Haba. So we should understand and realize that God is still saving us. He is still concerned about Olam Haba. He is still guaranteeing us Olam Haba. But the definition has changed. The rules have changed. And therefore it's a new day. It's a new day. That this day should also stop. That Jews should not earn their Olam Haba through their suffering, but they should earn their Olam Haba through their love and with the Kedusha. We should be restored to the Kedusha of Jews as an individual and go back to Eretz Yisrael in Gula, not in Golus. And then finally we should take back the Makomis Kedoshim that belong to us, and then the world will truly be totally at peace again. Okay, are there any questions?
Shimon, very strong. Wow. Thank you. Yeah, one, a couple of questions, but one, when you said in this year a little earlier that the highest level of Kedusha Klal Yisrael attained ever, or maybe since the Golus, was in the Holocaust, in what sense did you mean that? Why is that the case, that the highest
because
level
the Holocaust,
of Kedusha reached?
Because you have to understand, the Holocaust was the highest level of Kedusha through the principle of suffering. That when Hitler hated every Jew, and he said that every Jew is the devil himself and has to be annihilated in the ovens of the gas chambers, this was the highest persecution the Jews ever had as a people. This was the highest oppression of their soul. And therefore, as far as God is concerned, this was the highest level of their Avos Yisrael, because the redefinition of Avos Yisrael as unified suffering in common, was expressed during the Holocaust. And that's why the Holocaust brought the beginning of Eretz Yisrael and the Gula. And it's finally total to the time of the Mashiach, when all of this will stop.
So do you mean that in the Avos Yisrael it was almost Ein Tluya B'Davar, it was not totally in any action, just the essence of the Jew itself? Is that what you mean? in the Ava part? Their unification was just because of their name, who their essence was, what they are, not of any action.
I'm not. That's what Hitler said. I hate the Jews because they destroyed. Their 10 Commandments have destroyed mankind by putting God as the dominant will over mankind, and therefore they have to be destroyed. They have to be annihilated. So God was after. Hitler was after the Jewish soul.
Right. Right, that's what you're saying. The yichud was about the Jewish soul itself.
That's what I'm saying, right?
Very strong.
Any other questions?
Shimon, I would maybe this is what you're saying, but I would say it a little stronger. I think that Hitler's hatred to Jews, till now they hated Jews, Torah Jews, mitzvah Jews, but Hitler extended to assimilated Jews. So assimilated Jews were able to get a certain kedusha that they weren't able to get till now. Because Hitler hated them as being Jewish. They didn't do anything. Just by being Jewish, they were hated and persecuted. So they retained the kedusha even though they were in the lowest level of tumah, because they already disassociated themselves from Torah and mitzvahs and God. But they still got the kedusha from Hitler.
But you have to. There's one thing that I have to say on this. So, there have been many tzaddikim in the previous generations, yes. But there was one person who was not a tzaddik, but he was one of the most deepest spiritual people that ever existed. And who was that? Hitler. You understand? Hitler understood the Jew. This is not a joke. Hitler understood the Jew better than he understood himself. Hitler understood that the essence of a Jew, no matter where he is or what he is always that he will allow God to fundamentally dominate the world, that he believes in the creation of God. The 10 Commandments is nothing more than the fact that God determines the will of man, and God is in control. And that's a Jewish invention, because the invention of the Goyim was Avodah Zorah, that God is represented by the stars and planets. But the Jew represented God as the ultimate dominant spiritual being, different from all the Goyim of the world. And the Goyim who said that they want to become Jewish, they want to take away, rob Judaism from the Jews, really created a religion which is somewhat similar to the Jews. You see it. And they claim now that they are Jews. But this is the point. Hitler understood this profusely and profoundly. He understood that the essence of a Jew is morality and God. And he said, I have to destroy the concept, and the concept built by the Jews, promoted by the Jews, and fundamentally it concludes with the Jews. They are the enemy of mankind. So this is a very spiritual concept. This is the concept of Amalek. That you think that Amalek is a Russia because he's a hefkemensch. He does whatever he wants. No, he's an Amalekite is a person who truly understands the relationship between God and the Jews and says they have to be annihilated because this is the greatest poison ever introduced into man. What? The fact is that God rules over man. No, man rules over God. Man is God. And this concept of Amalek is the concept which is understood by Hitler and Haman. Every Amalekite understands this concept. And every Amalekite, therefore, targets the soul of a Jew, not the body of the Jew. He wants to annihilate the Torah, which is the essence of the soul. And Hitler was the greatest one of them all. So in a certain sense, in his recognition, he was a very spiritual person, but from the dark side. But he understood what a Jew is. He was not confused. And he said, based on my understanding, they have to be annihilated. And then when the reporter said to him, but the Christians are also keep the 10 Commandments. So he said, Christians, back. It's nothing more than a Jewish sect. Christianity is really a division of Judaism because they believe in the same concept of God and spirituality, of divinity. And The main ones who are responsible for this, who corrupted mankind, is the Jew. So I maintain that Hitler had the spirituality of an Amalekite, which is a very high level of spirituality, but it's from the dark side. It wants to annihilate God, not promote him. Any other questions?
Shimon, what you're saying now would explain very nicely why Amalek needs to be eradicated for the Gula to come, because he essentially represents the core of Namadik Sufa, the side of
life,
of non-divinity of man.
Exactly. What you're saying is very good. That's exactly why Amalek is considered such a dangerous nation, because he represents the essence of anti-God. He stands for the annihilation of the concept of God, the concept of divinity, the concept of morality, the concept of the word no. The Jew represents the word no, thou shalt not. And that's what he invented, and that's what God told him, and that's what he brings to mankind. And because of that, he is in tremendous danger. But God promised him, I will not let them destroy you, even though they hate you, as long as you love each other. But on the moment you no longer love each other and you have contempt for each other, there's the only way I can protect you is how? Is through their anti-Semitism. When they hate you, they will still keep you as one people. You will remain an organism, because hatred destroys the organism, right? But I will maintain you as an organism. How? Because they will all hate you. And the unity, the commonality of that hate will make you one people again. So either one way or another, either one direction or another, you will always be a single people destined for Olam Haba.
Wow. Shimon,
okay.
Reb Shimon, could you clarify, during the share you said two things. You said in the concept of an individual Olam Haba stop, and now so organismic Olam Haba, right, through the klal rather than the individual. But then you also said that every mitzvah became extremely powerful, like Reb Chaim Vital was told by the Arizal. His mitzvahs are more powerful than Tanoim and early generations. That means if the mitzvahs are more powerful, then it should lead to say that everybody can get an individual Olam Haba. Why do they need to have the klal Olam Haba and the organismic Olam Haba when they have even though they have less mitzvahs, they have much more powerful mitzvahs?
No, it's not that. It's much more powerful, and it has to be more powerful because it's fewer mitzvahs. It's acharei miyat lahatois. That means, when suddenly your mitzvahs become more powerful, you don't have to do as many mitzvahs. God does not allow as many mitzvahs as before because you don't need them, really. So therefore, but that still doesn't replace the fact that anti-Semitism is of the Jew. And the Goyim hate Jews. They do their avodah, which makes up for their avodah that they don't do, which is sinas chinam. So fundamentally, they still have to make up. You don't understand. The only way the Jews can survive is as a total organism together. They cannot survive as individuals because as individuals they should love each other. They don't. So therefore, now their survival is totally on their mass suffering. Mass suffering, totality of the suffering is now what unifies them. And therefore, because of that, the mitzvahs themselves, each mitzvah becomes greater, but it doesn't restore the individuality. The individuality of a Jew is only earmarked when the Jew loves each other, when he's a true organism, not when he is a b'di'evedik organism. The ability to earn Olam Haba now is b'di'eved. It's not a chatchila. It's not initially. Because Olam Haba is an individual. But now he earns Olam Haba as a group, as a mass, as an ethnic group. And that's what he can do. And that's still an inferior level, which can only come from the organism, because he's part of the organism called Karo.
So, Shimon, you mean
what you're saying is like this. Let me clarify. What you're saying is like this. There's two parts. There's two key ingredients for Olam Haba. Number one, Klal Yisrael has to have Ahavas Yisrael. And in the old generations, in the earlier generations, the tzaddikim had it as an individual, that Ahavas Yisrael. They were totally full of love for other Yidden on their own. So they will accomplish that as an individual. And then there's also mitzvahs, the second part. So today, the first part we accomplish through Yisurim and through the organism. And the second part, the mitzvahs part, is we accomplish on our own because our mitzvahs are more powerful than the earlier generation. Is that accurate?
Yes, that's accurate. But you see, there's a certain Gemara that explains it very well. You don't remember the Gemara, or you really never understood it. And let me tell it to you quickly now, and you'll really understand. The Gemara says that why was the Beis Hamikdash destroyed? It was destroyed Kamsu bar Kamsa, because of two people, Kamsu bar Kamsa. That's what it says. That led to the destruction of the temple and the exile of Klal Yisrael out of Israel for the next 2,000 years. You got that? That's what the Gemara says. Now, when you look at that incident, that event, what did you really see? Did you see sinas chinam, unwanted hatred? No, you didn't see unwanted hatred. You saw an astounding level of sinner, of hatred, so that it transcends the individual. Klal Yisrael was no longer composed of individuals. Why? Because these two people hated each other. Okay, so one of them was making a wedding for his daughter, and he invited a friend of his, which maybe was Kamsa. Instead, they invited his enemy Bar Kamsa. So they invited the wrong guy. Instead of inviting the person who was his friend, he invited the person who was his enemy. And when he saw his enemy sitting at the table at the wedding, he said to him, "What are you doing here? I didn't invite you. Get out." So the man said, "Please don't do that. It'll be embarrassing. And and I will pay for my own food, whatever I eat. But let me say." So then he said, "No, you have to get out." So he said, "Look, I'll pay for half your wedding. The whole wedding I will pay for if you let me stay." So the other person said, "No, you can't even stay, even if you pay for half the wedding." So he said, "Forget it. I'll pay for the whole wedding. The whole wedding if you let me stay here and eat this one meal, because I don't want to be embarrassed." So you know what the other guy said? "Get out. Even if you paid me $50,000, which is what cost my wedding, it's not worth my $50,000 to have you here." That's my level of hatred. So when God saw this, did he see simply a Jew not liking another Jew? No. Did he see a Jew in disagreement to another Jew? No. What did God see? God couldn't believe what he was seeing. Even though the guy was offering him $50,000 to pay for the entire wedding, it was more important for him to get rid of him and shame him and so on and throw him out. Could you imagine the level of hatred? Like, you have to say to yourself, what did this guy do to him? You can understand if this guy, let's say, he raped his wife. I mean, a terrible misdeed. He would never let him come to the wedding. But what did this guy do? He didn't rape his wife. What did he do such hatred? So what God saw was the level of individual for one another. And because the sages, there were many sages at that wedding. The sages at that wedding did not interfere. They didn't say a thing. They did not protect the honor of that person that he hated. No. So he said, well, since they all said nothing, it probably is that. So what God saw, that fundamentally what happened, Klal Yisrael appeared as a new entity. Klal Yisrael is no longer an entity of individuals. That's right. There's no union, there's no glue that exists between individuals. So God has seen such levels of hatred. And if these people have this level of hatred, and I would assume not only does this person have this level of hatred for Kamsa or Bar Kamsa, whichever it was, but even the sages didn't even interfere. They didn't think it important enough to interfere with it. So that's why God said, I don't want to have anything to do with these people. People who are so separated that they are no longer individuals in a group. They are no longer individuals in a group. I will have nothing to do with. I will destroy my temple. I will no longer be there, and I will destroy. They will be in exile. In other words, I will fractionate this organism called God. I will abandon them. I will still be with them, but I'm going to change what I'm going to do. Instead of being their God as a unified, loving people, I will be their God, and they will be the common enemy of all of mankind. That's how I'll change. In other words, I will keep them unified through their hate and not through their love. And in a certain way, their unity will cause them to suffer as a unity, as a group. So the nature of Olam Haba changed. It was no longer Olam Haba for the individuals. It was no longer based on the majority of their deeds. It was Olam Haba for the group. It was Olam Haba was destined to the group. And since they are a part of the group, why? Because they are suffering with everyone else. So that's why they go to Olam Haba. The reason they go, because they're still associated with Jews. But they are not part of the Jewish people as an integral unit unto himself. They are part of the Jewish people as a collection of Jews. And therefore their Olam Haba has to do with being a collection of Jews, not being individual Jews. So you have to understand the story of Kamsa Bar Kamsa, that it indicated such an extreme level of contempt and hate that it destroyed the fact that Klal Yisrael is individuals and earns Olam Haba to the majority of their deeds. They only earn Olam Haba now for the fact that they all suffer together. They are one in suffering. It's called mass suffering. And it is a unit. And that's the Achdus of Klal Yisrael. And that became, in a certain sense, the Achdus of all those Neshamas who were born after the Chorban Bayis, the Bayis Rishon and Sheni. If you understand truly the story of Kamsa Bar Kamsa, you will understand what I am saying.
No, Shimon, I hear what you're saying, but I just want to make an important observation. When you're saying that it's equal, the Goyim sin of the Jews to Kamsa Bar Kamsa. Kamsa Bar Kamsa is a terrible story, and I'm not here in any way to justify it. But he didn't put Jews in gas chambers. He didn't cut off heads like the Crusaders did. He didn't burn Jews at the stake. So what you mean probably is the Hamavayish Chaveila Baraden Ein Lo Chelik L'Olam Haba Kilu Hargoy. These are Kiilus. They're terrible. And if you're going to mean that, then they're equal. But you'd never have stories of Jews actually taking 6 million Jews and gassing them, Chaz v'Shalom, in gas chambers. That you don't have. So you can't say it's the same scale, but what you mean is when you embarrass a Jew, it's like you killed him. So then God activates a goy to kill a Jew. That I hear. That you could say. But it's not exactly measure for measure. It's a lumdisha type of measure for measure.
Look,
and that has to do with the Kedusha.
We're not comparing the deeds of the Jews to each other. But you don't understand. When a Jew speaks Lashon Hara about another Jew, and by doing that, he affects his business, he affects his reputation, he affects another Jew. He destroys. Lashon Hara has the power to destroy a person.
Yeah.
You tell the right Lashon Hara to the right people, and the other person, the victim of the Lashon Hara, is finished. So don't tell me.
You can't say it's gas chambers and burning Jews, people at the stake. That's all I'm saying.
I'm not talking about gas chambers. I'm talking about that is a destruction. But it's not only simply murder. It's slow murder. It's a painful death because the person dies over time. A person whose life I don't think you understand what's going on here. A person whose life or whose reputation or his success has been destroyed fundamentally is dead. He's a dead person who goes on living until he physically dies. You know how painful that is? And not only does it affect him, it affects him.
I'm not justifying that. I'm saying the person that did it. Just using very strong language here, condemning what Jews are doing to other Jews. I just want to clarify, a person that does it doesn't think what you're saying now, and he has a reason in his mind. Oh, that guy started with me, so I have to get him back. All kinds of reasons that don't make sense. But just to be down a little lekavschus, it's not equal to gas chambers and burning people at stake. That's all I'm saying. When you say something so strongly,
it's not an issue of being done lekavschus, because by you trying to done the Jew lekavschus, you're judging God the kafra. God knows what He's doing, and He does not give an inappropriate, unbalanced conclusion to someone who doesn't deserve it. So. You're not really protecting
Maybe it's
not a question. Look, we are incapable.
Rav Shimon, what I'm trying to do is go after the emes. What's the emes? Did you have
not the emes
story that Jews put other Jews and burnt them at the stake? Tell me, yes or no. Was there such a story? Could you recall such a case? Did that happen ever in history?
That's not the thing that's in. Please, can I say something?
If you're saying a language that exactly what Goyim did to Jews, Jews did to other Jews, then you have to find me a case of 6 million Jews being put by Jews in gas chambers. That's the emes. We're after the emes. You have to say that. Yeah, you could say Lashon Hara is terrible and it's equivalent. Yes, that's Ke'ilu. You could say that. But if you want to really make measure for measure to the T, you have to find me such a case, and I believe you can't find it. That's the emes. That's the truth.
Well, okay. So what I'm going to say to you is the following: death by Lashon Hara and Ruchilas is a slow death. Death by a gas chamber is a fast death. Just in the amount of pain that you feel alone. I'm not talking about the ultimate destination of the dead, but the pain involved between Lashon Hara for the rest of your life, where you are a destroyed human being, and the pain of the gas chamber is not equal. The death by Lashon Hara is worse, and therefore God knows what He's doing. And I'm not saying that Lashon Hara is the only way. Other ways also, theft, shame, and everything that exists between Jews themselves, unfortunately, bear a tremendous amount of reality. And I can't measure this thing. I'm not putting myself up to measure it and so on. But the reason why I say that every measure of anti-Semitism that the Jews feel is equal to their own anti-Semitism. How? I'm not even measuring that. I'm not qualified to truly measure this. But I'm saying if God is doing that, you are not a greater tzaddik than God. And you do not know what's involved. You do not know all the variables and the avenues of exactly what's involved when other Jews, when one Jew hates another. When there's a fight between Hasidim, one group of Hasidim hate the other ones, this goes on for years. And this is carried over in every aspect of their life, in their family life, in their marriages life, in their shidduchim and so on. And it is an agony that rolls over and over and over again for years. Now, I don't have the ability to measure anything, and that's not my job. But I do know one thing. God is a dayan emes, and that's what you are opposing. God does not that which He does not deserve, because that is not even a moon anymore. And God is not that type of being. Now, I can't explain what God is doing in detail. I don't know. I don't know how to measure pain. I don't know how to measure destruction. I can't measure the whole thing. And therefore, I don't put myself up to measure that. It has nothing to do. When you put a Jew into a gas chamber, it is an instant death fundamentally. And then when he's put in an oven, he's dead already, so he doesn't feel anything. But when a Jew is alive and is destroyed, or is held in contempt, or is robbed, or is shamed, all these things, in a certain level, there's a greater pain in that death than in the other. So, you want to compare deaths and so on and so forth. You're naive. That's not how you look at it. And all I think
Shimon, I will ask you one question.
Can I just jump in for 1 second?
I don't want to ask. You don't understand. I don't want to argue.
If Shimon is not
saying
that it's equal, he's saying that the root.
I don't want to argue the point.
Rav Shimon, you're simply saying that it's not. You're simply saying that every ounce of Christian or Goyish anti-Semitism has an exact root of sinas kin between a Jew and another Jew. That's what you're saying. You're not measuring
but
the
don't
level.
make it equal. It's ridiculous.
Not an equal, but you don't know. But
God is not about.
Rather than say my own
story, God is
very hard to say. I'd rather say I don't understand the story, Daka Hashem. I don't understand it.
So then say that, but don't say it's fine. So say that you don't understand it, but don't say it's unequal. You're making a statement saying you have the ability to measure these things. We don't measure pain of human beings.
Shimon, I'll ask you one question. If you see two people doing an act, one person is talking Lashon Hara, and the other one is burning a Jew alive in a fire, who would you look at and say, this guy's an Achzagama, and the other guy you would not? Look, what's the reaction that you have when you see that? And the biggest riot that that's the case is, unfortunately, people speak Lashon Hara on their siblings, on family, on people that they love. But they will never kill somebody, most people, or burn somebody that they love. You see, the person has to be a bigger actor.
You don't see anything.
The two. You're saying in the oimik of it, in the oimik adin, you're right. In the oimik adin, you're right. What comes out in the long term, but the person doing it doesn't contemplate all those steps.
Do you mind if I talk?
I'm saying. I'm not.
Do you mind if I say something?
I just felt that this needs to be said because as much as you're justifying God, you are saying something very strong about Klal Yisrael, and
I'm going to say
that also. That's my opinion.
So, can I say something now?
Yeah, sure.
What I'm saying is this: when a person is in the ovens, no pain. The ovens is an act of contempt, that's true, but it's the act of contempt. That's number one. So even though it's a horrific act, of course, it's a terrible thing, but it has nothing to do with pain, number one. And even the death in the gas chambers is painful, but it's quickly done, and that's it. So when you measure the agony in terms of the amount of pain that you experience, you can't compare the pain when a person is being destroyed in his life, throughout his life, to the death in the gas chambers and the ovens. Because that death itself was the only instance of pain, and that lasted for a minute or two or whatever it was. Everything else was like was extra, was contempt, not pain. So therefore, you cannot compare the two. Even to say that there's certain Lashon Haras, and there could be thousands of instances of Lashon Hara, and thousands of instances where you defame someone, you destroy someone, or you cause an agony for an entire lifetime. You can't, because Lashon Hara contributes to a living pain. That's every minute, every second, and so on. Living consequences of sinas chinam and so on and so forth, and gezela and contempt and so on and so forth. This has a continuity to it that the death in the gas chamber does not have. So you are not considering that. You have the nature of the death of either of these two things. The nature of the death of being gassed and then being burnt in the oven, the ashes, is painful, but not as painful as the full lifetime course of death that could be done to Lashon Hara or Achilas or 100 other sins. So I completely differ with you. You're entitled to your opinion, and I grant you that, but I totally disagree with you. The difference between continuous experiencing pain and only momentary pain is vastly different, even though the method of death is much more dishonorable. You can have a much more dishonorable death, like the Jews had in the Nazis' camps, than another type of death, but it's much less painful. So I can't measure the pain, and I don't insist that I could, that I even want to. This is something in the province of God. But there's one thing I do know, that it is equal. You're saying it's unequal, and I completely disagree. God does not give unequal punishments. That's a rule. That's what it means, Dayan Emes. Dayan Emes, the true judge, means God does not give unequal pain, more pain for someone doing less pain. It doesn't happen. It doesn't exist. It's a contradiction to Dayan Emes. Now, can I actually calculate it? No. I have no way to calculate to even understand it. But I believe that what God is doing must be fundamentally correct. And the death of Jews on the Holocaust was a dishonorable death, very dishonorable, but it doesn't mean it was very painful in most cases. Maybe in some cases it was. But the amount of pain which is experienced, which is a true measure of a sin, we cannot calculate in any case. But one thing we can know, God does not give unequal pain to anyone who doesn't deserve it. And that's it. There's nothing to argue about that.
You have to take into consideration the mindset of the person perpetrating the act. And that
look,
act
you want to. I grant you. You want to.
Doesn't look
equal
as
you want.
vicious.
You want a malamed schusim to Klal Yisrael, and yet that's. I don't think.
And you know what? And I'm okay to say God is too deep for me to understand. One day He'll explain it. And
I think it's time to call it easier.
You're not saying God is too deep. You're saying God is. You're not saying that God is too deep. You're saying God is unequal. You use the word unequal, and just because you cannot.
No, I have no sugar what He's doing. I can't.
So then you can't even use
the.
You cannot use the word unequal.
Has the recording been turned off?
No.
No, not yet.
Shimon, what I'm hearing is the question is the Holocaust more of an Akedas Yitzchok than it is the Anhagas Hamishpat, where there's a finite against an infinite.
Exactly. Very well.
Is that the equation here? And that's what I think Yitzchak's trying to grapple with. Are we looking at a finite mind trying to understand an infinite mind? That was really how you explained a big component of the Akedas Yitzchak, where there's no way to justify God's action to the human mind. And Avram was blamed on the Nisayan of not trying to justify it, just accepting it due to his being a finite being, having no ability to truly comprehend. I think that's what Yitzchak's trying to say, that in maybe another way.
He's trying to understand to some extent the nature of the experience itself. And I grant you cannot really understand. You cannot understand the nature of the experience. But if you really want to look at both of the experience, you can see a certain quality that escapes the mind. And he's missing the quality of continuity. But we don't have to discuss this. We don't have,
Shimon, I guess the question is, can you identify the Holocaust? The Akedas Yitzchak has no human way to be explained. And that's why it's so great of a pivot moment in Klal Yisrael. The enormity of the Holocaust does not lie in its pain. No, not in its pain. It lies in its complete contempt. The shame, the way the Jews died was shameful.
total contempt, but it does not lie in the concept of pain. It's possible that the pain that the Jews, it's possible that the pain that the Jews experience by continuous sinas chinam and contempt and everything in a continuous basis over long periods of time can far be greater than the pain of dying in the Holocaust. That's all I'm saying, but we cannot even judge this because God does not give anything unequal. That's the concept of a judge. And that's what I am saying. You know,
maybe you're not measuring pain. You're measuring contempt versus contempt. Maybe it's the contempt of one Jew to the other, not the pain that he causes them, which would answer Pointer's question.
Okay, we can think about it.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
But Rabbi, could I ask you a question?
Is that case? I'm sorry. Is Akedah Yitzchak understood in the format of Mishpat? I mean, the Nisayon of Akedah Yitzchak is larger than the emes of Mishpat. Is that true? Is that the chiddush of the Akedah Yitzchak that Avram was omer on in one component?
The problem of the Akedah Yitzchak is this: it was not only that Yitzchak had to die. That was one thing, that Yitzchak had to die because God changed. It seemed to be God changed his mind. The problem with the real Akedah, which is actually never mentioned, is that God told Avram that he has to kill his son. The father has to kill his son. That's really a different level of pain. But the problem wasn't only the fact that Yitzchak had to die. That was a lower level of pain. And it was also a very great pain to Avram because it meant the end of mankind. But that was a lower level. But the fact that he had to do it, you know what I mean, in that sense. But it's a different measurement. It's a different criteria why he had to do it and so on. But that's something else. Okay, thank you all for listening. I appreciate all of you listening and so on. And
thank you, Rabbi Shimon. An amazing share. This is what
this we need to... out. This year brings out concepts which are really not visible on the surface, and what's really going on, and so on. But you see this in a certain way. And the one liar that I didn't say, but I will speak about maybe another time, is that you see this principle that sometimes God protects a person by having everyone hate him. Right? I'm saying you this principle. Sometimes God protects a person when everyone hate him. And that protects the person himself. And where do you see this? By Yosef HaTzadik. All the brothers hated Yosef. And that was a protection for Yosef, that he could actually succeed possibly in converting Egypt. But it was obvious that Yosef could not do his task, which was to Makav Mitzrayim to the Geula, without him being hated. Because the Ketugim was so great that the only way that he could be protected from the hate and his mission could be successful, and it was successful up to a point, is when everyone hated him. And by him lighting that thing and lighting the consequences of hate, which were continuous, because he was in Egypt all the time under terrible conditions as a slave and as a prisoner, that protected him from the ketugim of his mission. Sometimes God will do that. He will protect you from your mission when there's a lot of accusations against it. He will protect you by becoming an object of hate. So there are many different ways that God will handle it. But clearly, God handled the sinas chinam of the Jews to each other in all their compositions and variables by having them the target of anti-Semitism for 2,000 years. Okay, thank you very much for listening.
And you're saying that protected Klal Yisrael's mission?
Yes.